Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and I want to talk a little bit about Tobe Hooper and the Cannon Group. So, Tobe Hooper was a director who delivered the goods in the scare department. I mean, his film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is literally one of the scariest movies ever made, and it still holds up to this day. And his next film, Eaten Alive, I wasn't a fan of it, but it does have its fan base, and I will give it credit for at least trying to follow in Texas Chainsaw's footsteps and you know taking a look at the dark side of America. But his work, his next work, the Salem Slot miniseries, I thought was definitely one of his best efforts, and it was certainly a good Stephen King adaptation, and it brought him some mainstream respectability since it was released as a two-part miniseries on network television. And then the Funhouse, I thought continued the trend of exploring the dark side of America by way of having the carnival be a source of horror. I mean, I know there's carnivals in other parts of the world, but Americans love a carnival, and so a place of fun ends up being a source of horror. But then Poltergeist came around, and that was the movie that should have put Tobe Hooper on the map as an A-list director. But unfortunately, while the film, it was a huge success at the box office, and the critics loved it, and audiences loved it, and it was even nominated for some Academy Awards, it served as a blessing and a curse for Tobe Hooper, because while it was certainly one of the best horror films to come out of the 80s, it also tarnished his reputation as a director, or at least it tarnished his credibility as a director, because while he was, served as the film's director, executive producer Steven Spielberg had a lot of pull with the movie, and a lot of it, was because it was a film that he had originally wanted to make, but because of contractual obligations, he could only work on E.T., which he was working on that same year. So he could only direct E.T., and he couldn't direct Poltergeist. And so, he tapped Tobe Hooper to direct it. And the two of them at that point in time were friends. And amongst other things, they both had a shared affinity for, the paranormal. But, what ended up happening, though, was that a lot of people involved in Poltergeist, have recollections of being directed by both Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg, or sometimes they would say that, well, I mean, yeah, Tobe Hooper was on set and everything, but Spielberg was doing the directing. Or other times people would say that, I mean, they remembered Tobe Hooper directing them. And, having seen the work of both directors up to this point, I would say that Poltergeist definitely feels more like a Spielberg film than a Hooper film, but I'm not going to sit there and say that Hooper's, presence is altogether absent, because, if you look at his aforementioned films or his aforementioned works, I mean, the the exploration of America's dark side is continued, and in this case, it's an exploration of the dark side of suburbia. But on the other hand, though, when it comes to say like the acting and the character development and the special effects and the music score, I mean, it all feels like Spielberg. But to be fair, since Spielberg was definitely the bigger name at the time and still is the bigger name, and he had already done Raiders of the Lost Ark and Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This was a guy who knew what he wanted. And so because Poltergeist was a movie that he had wanted to make, it's possible that, he didn't serve as a director per se, but he wanted to make sure that the movie was done his way. And so Tobe Hooper got to direct it, but Spielberg was minding the store the whole way through. And so, another thing that came out was, Tobe Hooper, and talked about it in an interview about how it was something along the lines of he was running behind on filming one day, and so so Spielberg came in to direct a couple of shots to sort of keep things going. And so as it happened, some people from the press, happened to be, on this, on set that day, and they saw Spielberg, filming things and directing. So they're kind of like, well, wait a minute, we thought Tobe Hooper was directing. What's going on here? And so, apparently from there, the thing spiraled, and, the rumors persisted, and it got to a point where Spielberg had to, issue an open letter, to Tobe Hooper, giving him credit, but it was also meant for, the public to read as well. But people, to this day, claim that that was just a form of damage control. But, it's sad that Tobe Hooper passed away. But one of the things that's, kind of, came about because of that was, a lot of people, in the industry, as well as people who were involved with Poltergeist, are kind of going out of their way to, give Tobe Hooper credit for the film after all these years, and just saying, hey, it was his film, So maybe like it's their way of tossing the dog a bone, but the point is, Poltergeist was a success, but it also served to, damage his credibility as a director, because so many people, were like, well, it feels more like a Spielberg film than a Hooper film, or, it was directed by Spielberg versus, Hooper, and Hooper was just a dummy director. But debate still goes on to this day. So as far as the Cannon Group, though, the Cannon Group was a B-movie production company that turned out low-budget films, and a good amount of times their movies were schlock, but every now and then they'd get some, you'd have some good movies or decent movies to come out, from the Cannon Group, but those tended to be the exceptions to the rule, because one of the problems that the Cannon Group had was that, the guys in charge of it, his Israeli cousins, Golan and Globus, they loved making movies, but they didn't seem to know how to consistently make good ones. And also, they never seemed to have a maintained period of financial stability. Like, they had some financial successes, but they had the budgets they had weren't able to keep up with the movies they were making. Like, they would release several movies, but they'd only have enough budgets for a few of them. So that's why so many of their movies were low budget. But but what ended up happening, though, was that Tobe Hooper and the Cannon Group would go on to do a 3-picture deal together. They would do the movies Lifeforce in 1985, and then in 1986 they would do Invaders from Mars and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And unfortunately, all 3 films, did not do well when they came out, critically or financially. But over time, they've been reevaluated, and especially in the case of, Lifeforce and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And both of those films to this day, today, are actually regarded as, cool films that, came out of, cool horror films that came out of the 80s. But I want to kind of, explore this sort of, hypothetical scenario or alternate reality where, Tobe Hooper and the Cannon Group still collaborated on those 3 films, but things were different and the trajectories were better. So, okay, we're going, with the notion that in this alternate reality, Tobe Hooper had still done, the films that I'd already mentioned, including Poltergeist. And so, he still has some controversy attached to him as far as, okay, did he really direct Poltergeist or not? But the thing is, Poltergeist was a hit, and Tobe Hooper has a knack for turning out, good horror films. And even, darkly comical, material as well. Because if you look at, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Salem's Lot, and The Funhouse, there are good moments of dark comedy in those films. And so then we bring another player into the mix, John Cassavettes. Okay, so in real life, in 1984, the actor/director John Cassavettes acted and directed he acted in and directed a film called Love Streams for the Cannon Group. And Love Streams is reputedly one of the best films to come out of the Cannon Group, but unfortunately, not a lot of people saw it when it came out. But people like Roger Ebert were singing its praises, and a lot of international directors really, appreciated the film. And you know, I still need to see it, to be fair. But of the Cannon Group movies I've seen, I mean, I would say that Runaway Train was probably the one great film that I've seen that came out of the Cannon Group. But I've heard that Love Streams is supposedly better than that, albeit in a different way. So I need to put that on my list. But okay, so in our reality, John Cassavetes did Love Streams in 1984. In this alternate reality, he would still go on to do Love Streams in 1984. But in this alternate reality, in the year 1983, the Cannon Group, taps Tobe Hooper to direct a dark comedy starring John Cassavetes. Okay, and so maybe I'm drawing a little bit of inspiration from the movie, Joker with Joaquin Phoenix here, but John Cassavetes, he had a certain intensity when it came to, say, his performances, and he also had an intensity when it came to directing movies, because I haven't seen his movies, at least not that I know of, but I've heard that, there are films that, kind of like Tobe Hooper's, work, they explore the dark side of America, but more so they explore the dark side of interpersonal relationships, and they explore characters who are in situations that spiral further and further out of control. And so I imagine that Tobe Hooper directing John Cassavetes in a dark comedy would, for the Cannon Group, would actually be a fascinating effort, because I imagine it'd be something like a film. Tobe Hooper would be directing, a dark comedy for the Cannon Group about a comedian, a suicidal comedian played by John Cassavetes in an urban, hell, who at the climax of the film snaps and tries to murder his audience. So with John Cassavetes, having played, unhinged characters before, or at least, extremely stressed out characters, or just plain intense characters before, and him, being able to direct, these kind of performances in the films that he's directed, he'd probably be right at home in a role like that. And Tobe Hooper, being able to, convey a sense of unease in rural landscapes would probably thrive in filming, the stress and, chaos of, early 80s, urban environments, and, with, John Cassavetes playing, a comedian who's gradually, breaking down. I mean, it'd be like watching a ticking time bomb, before it goes off. And I imagine the climax of the movie would be rather, haunting and, controversial. But the film wouldn't be without its comedy, though, because, I mean, it is about a comedian who's gradually going insane. And so there'd have to be some dark comedy there. But I imagine that while it wouldn't be without some form of controversy, I mean, what with, the comedian, snapping and murdering his audience at the end. I mean, this wouldn't be just John Cassavetes, jumping off the stage and trying to strangle people, because at that point, it'd be like, okay, just hold the guy down, But I imagine it'd be him, basically, walking into a studio and bringing a gun with him. And then after some morbid one-liners, or morbid observations about humanity, he then, takes literal pot shots at the audience, So I imagine to be a film that would be haunting for audiences and critics, but it's something that would actually do well. It wouldn't be a blockbuster, but because it would be made on a low budget, because Cannon Group would be a low budget company, I mean, at this point I should mention, okay, in this alternate reality, the Cannon Group, they're more financially stable. They stick with what they're good at. And so they make this low budget movie, and they're working with a director who's skilled in delivering the goods with low budgets, as well as a director who's skilled in the same. Because John Cassavetes, he would be in Hollywood films, but he would use the fee that he got from those films to finance his low budget independent films. And Tobe Hooper, the films he worked on were usually low budget, but then of course Poltergeist had an A-list budget. So you could definitely work in both areas, but this would be a low budget dark comedy, right? But because they're utilizing a genuine urban landscape, they could definitely do a lot with natural resources. So I imagine the movie wouldn't be a smash, but would it be a success? It would be a success, and critics would actually come away respecting it, and they would definitely respect the fact that Tobe Hooper was doing something different, and as well as John Cassavetes doing his thing. So going forward into the year 1984, in this alternate reality, John Cassavetes would still act in and direct the movie Love Streams for the Can Group, but because of the success of this dark comedy collaboration with Tobe Hooper, Love Streams might actually enjoy a better advertising campaign, and as a result more people would see it, and it would be much better known than it is in our reality. But as far as Tobe Hooper goes, this is where I'm going to draw from another element from the real world, because in our reality, one of the other potential collaborations that Tobe Hooper and the Can Group were going to have was a science fiction version of the story Pinocchio. And it was going to be co-written by Dan O'Bannon, the guy who co-wrote Alien, as well as Tobe Hooper's own Lifeforce and Invaders from Mars. And it was also going to star Lee Marvin as Geppetto. And so if you look online, you could actually find a black and white illustration from a trade magazine that shows an elderly, character, presumably Geppetto, working on Pinocchio. And Pinocchio has like a human face, but a robot body, like an android, right? And it's a pretty cool illustration, but unfortunately, the film never came to be. I don't know why exactly. It's hard to find information as far as why it fell through, but it did. But in this alternate reality, though, 1984 rolls around, and the Pinocchio project goes through, because at this point, the Cannon Group see, they were succeeding with their low-budget films, but one of the aspirations they had was to make art house films. And so having produced the Tobe Hooper film with John Cassavetes, it would basically be a darkly comical art house film, albeit one with a shocking ending. And so part of their aspirations were being realized right there. And because the film was a success, they're like, well, hey, why don't we try something even more different? And so they decide to go with Pinocchio. This would be a higher budgeted film than what they would normally work with, but they want to take the risk. And so they don't lavish, the budget that they would lavish on Lifeforce, but it would be a higher budgeted film than normal, enough to say convey a science fiction futuristic setting. And so then, with Lee Marvin as Geppetto, I imagine it'd be something along the lines of, Geppetto in this sci-fi setting would be a character with a military background. I mean, someone who maybe fought in a battle, and unfortunately, though, is not only suffering from PTSD, but is suffering from depression, due to the fact that while he was, fighting in a war, he had a family back home, or he had a son back home who ended up dying. And so, he fights in battle and comes home from, war, but I mean, he's already, messed up from what he's seen and experienced in the war. But then he, gets home to find out that his son passed away while he was gone. So this would be something that would really, break him. And send him into a fit of depression. But Geppetto, though, was someone that wanted to be a creator. He didn't want to be a destroyer. He wanted to be a creator. And so, due to, his depression, and also, maybe wanting to make amends for the lives, he's, taken, or he had taken in battle, he creates a new son, an android in the likeness of the son who died while he was away at war. And that's where you would get an android version of Pinocchio. So you'd have Geppetto, trying to, work with Pinocchio and teach him, how to be human and try and raise him as his own son. But somewhere along the way, Pinocchio would get separated from Geppetto. And this is where the character of Jiminy Cricket would come in. Okay, but except in this, scenario, in this alternate reality with this sci-fi Pinocchio, it wouldn't be Jiminy Cricket. It would just be an alien named Jiminy, albeit one that sort of looks like a humanoid cricket. And this is where, prosthetic and makeup effects would have to come in. Maybe some animatronic stuff, because at this point, Canon, they're investing enough resources, to not only make the film look good, but they want the aliens and, to look good as well. But here's where I think it'd be cool if they'd have someone like, say, Robert Englund playing the character of Jiminy, because Robert Englund had already played an alien character on the TV show V, which I haven't actually seen V, but I remember, friends and family telling me about it from like way back in the day, right? And, they, pointed out that, that was one of the things that, kind of helped him to, how you get a lot of recognition, prior to Nightmare on Elm Street. So this being 1984, Robert Englund would still go on to play Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street, but this would be like right before that, albeit within the same year. So him playing this alien version of Jiminy Cricket, Jiminy, like, I imagine it'd be something along the lines of, because he's an alien, he doesn't have the same sense of morality that humans do, but that doesn't mean he'd be an evil character, just, kind of a, mildly sinister character, simply because his morality and our morality, don't necessarily line up. But he would nonetheless be a genuine friend to Pinocchio. Like, maybe they cross paths and, and they go on an adventure together, and he ends up being a friend and protector and kind of a mentor to Pinocchio. But at the same time, Pinocchio is trying to, adhere to the teachings of Geppetto. And so it's like the two of them sort of rub off on each other. Like, Pinocchio might pick up on some of Jiminy's, darker, cynicism, whereas, Jiminy might pick up on, Pinocchio's, altruism and innocence, and in the meantime, Geppetto would be, trying like hell to, find his son, because, he created a life, and now that life has been taken from him. And so, not by Jiminy, mind you, but just, circumstances outside his control. And so there'd definitely be an element of darkness to the story, but it wouldn't be, say, an altogether, horror story or anything like that, but there would be an element of darkness to it, what with, Geppetto suffering from PTSD, as well as, the character of Jiminy, not quite understanding, human morality and things like that. But at the same time, it would be semi-family friendly, and it'd be like a child's fairy tale with adult sensibilities, probably like something along the lines of Ridley Scott's Legend. And you look at that movie, that's a kid's fairy tale come to life, but with adult sensibilities. And so I imagine that this version of Pinocchio would be something along those lines, like in terms of, say, a dark fairy tale, but one that both adults and kids could enjoy. And for the music, I'm a fan of the Moody Blues, and I like Mike Pinder on the Mellotron, and I like Patrick Moraz on the keyboards, but this being the 80s and this alternate reality, I think that it would be cool if, they were able to get Patrick Moraz to do, the score for this film. And, having heard his work on the Yes album Relayer, as well as the Movie Blues albums Long Distance Voyager and The Present, I mean, it's good stuff. It really is. And then, another thing he did in terms of solo work in the 80s was a two-part album called Future Memories. And if you like 80s keyboards and you like Patrick Moraz, definitely check out Future Memories. I would highly recommend that album. But having heard his work there, I think that he could really, pull off a score that, worked for a science fiction film that had both, wonder as well as darkness. And it could, because he also did the score for the horror film from the 80s, The Stepfather. So having Patrick Moraz, do a score for the science fiction version of Pinocchio, I think would be a bit of a coup. And so in this alternate reality, this version of Pinocchio gets made. And I don't know how much of a success it would be financially, but it would be a success, I think. And it's a gamble, by, the Cannon Group as well as Tobe Hooper that ended up paying off. And you'd have, a critically acclaimed performance by Lee Marvin as well as, Robert Englund as, a critically acclaimed performance by Lee Marvin as Geppetto as well as Robert Englund as Jiminy. And plus, the production design, the score. I mean, it'd be a fondly remembered film from the 80s, I think. A very different film, but a fondly remembered one, too. And so it'd be a gamble that would pay off. And it'd be a success at the box office. And so going into 1985, this would also, the success of Pinocchio would give the Cannon Group confidence to, take another risk. And in this case, the movie Lifeforce, in which, as they did in our reality, they would invest $25 million into making Lifeforce. And in this alternate reality, I mean, the Cannon Group is still financially stable, but after, the hit of Pinocchio, they decide, okay, let's do something else again. Let's do something different again with Tobe Hooper, but this time a sci-fi horror film. And so Lifeforce was an adaptation of the Colin Wilson sci-fi horror novel Space Vampires, which I haven't read yet, so I wouldn't be able to compare the two. But I will say that Lifeforce was actually a pretty cool movie. I've got it on Blu-ray, and my girlfriend, when we were starting to see each other, she actually asked me if I wanted to go see Lifeforce at Alamo Drafthouse, because they had this week where they were playing 80s vampire movies. And so when she asked me that, I was like, yes, please, because I had never seen Lifeforce on the big screen, and she had never seen it before. And so we really enjoyed it, and I was just like, man, I'm watching a movie that came out when I was born on the big screen. And it was really cool. And there were even moments where I jumped, where it's like I saw the same scenes at home and I didn't jump, but seeing them on the big screen, I did. But it was a cool movie. It really was. It's unfortunate that it didn't do well when it came out, and it only took, and it's unfortunate that it took the amount of time that it did to be, properly recognized as a, good 80s sci-fi horror film. But what ended up happening in real life was that the Cannon Group invested $25 million into Lifeforce, but it bombed, and only made 11 million or 11 million and change. And that ended up hurting the Cannon Group rather badly, because at that point in real life, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, they had the problem of, not having the budget to keep up with the movies they were making. And so when they invested 25 million into Lifeforce, they were putting everything on the line for that movie. And so the movie, in when it bombed, it ended up hurting the Cannon Group, and so as a result, the budgets that they'd had for other films, beyond Life Force, ended up being slashed, including Hooper's own Invaders from Mars and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And so, Invaders from Mars was originally supposed to have a higher budget, but only ended up having $7 million. And at the box office, it only made somewhere around 4. So not as big of a bomb as Life Force was, but it was still a bomb. And then Texas Chainsaw 2 was also supposed to have a higher budget, but only ended up having a budget of 4.5 million and 4.6 million. And at the box office, though, it made 8 million and change, I believe. And so at least it made back half its budget. So of the 3 films, it was the most successful, but at the same time, neither 3 films were what you'd call a success, critically or financially. And it's only through reevaluation years later that Life Force and Texas Chainsaw 2 have come to be regarded as good films. But in Invaders from Mars, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a good film, but I think it's better than, it deserved better than what it got. But like it was a decent film, I would say. But in this alternate reality, though, because of the 2 successful collaborations that Cannon and Tobe Hooper had together, what with the dark comedy and then with this sci-fi version of Pinocchio, they decided, okay, let's do Life Force. But in this reality, though, in this alternate reality, they, instead of having Steve Railsback play the doomed astronaut Carlson, the main character, they go with Michael Biehn, okay? And this is something that, I think they should have done in real life, and I think that would have helped the film, because Michael Biehn excelled at playing, a character in the film The Terminator, Kyle Reese, someone who had a military background and was a badass, but was all too human. He had the same vulnerabilities as we did, and was a tragic character and a haunted character as well, but a dangerous one too. And him bringing that to the character of Carlson, I think would have made Carlson that much more fleshed out and developed character, and a more sympathetic one, as opposed to, say, an entertainingly crazy one as Steve Railsback played him in the version that was in our reality, But as far as Michael Biehn being in the movie, I think in this alternate reality, that would have definitely helped the movie get a better reception. And also, Canon having a better sense of financial stability and a better sense of marketing, would have been able to get proper advertising for the movie. And then another thing that would be different was that there'd be more of an element of a dark, twisted love story between Carlson, as played by Michael Biehn, and the space girl, the lead space vampire, as played by Matilda May. And so those of you who've seen Life Force in real life, in our reality, know that Matilda May was very beautiful and also very naked throughout most of the movie, but she managed to nail the combination of raw sensuality and otherworldly horror with her performance. And that would, be true in this alternate reality as well. But there would be more of a dark, tragic love story there, because I imagine if the writers, and the people who made the movie took more of a chance, I mean, there'd still be a nightmarish vampiric outbreak in London, but there would be this twisted love story between Carlson and the space girl, one wherein both characters, having, interacted with each other and absorbed each other's, essences, I mean, they'd come to understand each other and come to care for each other. So while she's ultimately a predatory entity, she would feel something genuine, like some sort of genuine affection for Carlson. And Carlson, in turn, while he would still be obsessed with her, he would also be drawn to her, in the sense that, you know, she is a parasitic entity, but she does care for him, and he comes to care for her too. And so it'd be like a dark, a dark subversion of the role that Michael Biehn played in Terminator, wherein Kyle Reese is trying to find Sarah Connor to protect her. He's trying to find the space girl to stop her, but is he gonna, when he finds her, is he going to kill her, or is he going to give in to her? And in between all that, you know, how much of it is their how much of their love is real, and how much of it is something that they're feeling for each other, but is only because of their mental connection and the chaos of, you know, two, different life forms, colliding. So I just think that with that approach, Lifeforce probably would have had a better reception at the time it came out, because I mean, people like intelligent horror stories. And when it comes to, say, eroticism and what have you, they like intelligence with eroticism too. And so this version of Lifeforce would have all that, plus the chaotic, vampiric outbreak as well. But in this reality, though, maybe there'd even be, an Oscar nomination for the special effects, because in our reality, the Lifeforce that was made had some awesome special effects that frankly should have been nominated, I think. But, in this alternate reality, the movie gets a better reception, and it definitely does much better at the box office, to a point where it's a box office hit for the Cannon Group as well as for Tobe Hooper, and it gets an Oscar nomination for special effects. So, with that success in mind, I think it would also help, Michael Biehn, in his career trajectory as well, because, he'd still go on to do Aliens, but he would show that he was capable of carrying a film in a lead role, because he was kind of a lead role in The Terminator, and he was one of the main actors in Aliens, but here in Lifeforce, in this, hit film, he would be the main actor in that film. And so, and with that film's success, well, there you go. Definitely securing his place as one of the go-to guys of the 80s, or 80s sci-fi horror. But as far as Tobe Hooper, I think that this would definitely be a boon to him, because, in his next two films for the Cannon Group, the higher budgets would still be in place. And so Invaders from Mars and Texas Chainsaw 2 would have better productions and better receptions as well. So, yeah, I think about stuff like this. In case it's not obvious, for me, it's fun, and I like talking, about stuff like this sometimes. And it would have been cool had things, gone down like this in real life. Unfortunately, that's not how it really went down. But I like to think that in talking about these alternate, realities, who knows? Maybe by talking about it, an alternate reality is coming to be. I've certainly heard that school of thought before, but even if that's not true, it is still cool to talk about, as far as what if, Tobe Hooper's career trajectory had gone differently and for the better, and what if, the Cannon Group had, not gone so, crazy with, their money spending, because I've seen some of their stuff, and there was a lot of potential, for them to go beyond, their, traditional B grade output. It just, unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. But I think that it would have been cool to see those films, though. the dark comedy, with John Cassavettes that came up with, um, the sci-fi version of Pinocchio that almost was in this reality but fell through. I mean, and of course, Lifeforce with the changes I described. I mean, I honestly think that would have been a better movie too. But as it is, I mean, we got what we got in real life. But it's certainly fun to think about what might have been or could have been in another reality. So, anyway, if you made it this far, I appreciate you listening to my ramblings about alternate realities and hypothetical scenarios within the realms of cinema. So, if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And you got any questions, comments, please feel free to drop a line and let me know. So, y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.